on guys, Austin here, and today I'm going to be going over how to make a lo-fi hip-hop type instrumental in Logic Pro X. Now if you're unfamiliar with lo-fi hip-hop, it goes by a bunch of different names. There is Boom Bap for a quick nap, the SP404 Blues, or Melodies for A's and B's. Either way, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that today. Before we do anything in Logic, I'm just going to very briefly show you where you can find samples to flip for lo-fi hip-hop. The very first thing you can go to is if you type in Hot Samples Reddit, it'll take you to this page. All you have to do is hit either of these plus buttons and you can preview any of these samples. I found quite a few gems on this page. There are several channels that post records that you could possibly flip daily. There's Peaceful Production, there's Vinyl Frontier 2, and then there's Ricardo. I'm not going to try to pronounce this. I'm just going to leave all of these three channels in the description below just in case you can't find them. In my past videos, I've gone over samples to chop, so you probably already are aware of this, but if not, you just type in samples to chop on YouTube and you're going to see a ton of playlists full of hundreds of different records and artists that you can sample from. Now, this is really great because when you're online, you know the sound, but you don't know exactly what you're looking for. And people have curated lists and kind of created online crates that you would find in a record store. And that's the usual environment that you want to be in when you're looking for records. And that kind of brings me to this. You have a local record store. You could just go to the jazz, soul, or gospel section and look through a bunch of records, hopefully listen to them if the record store will allow you to. And another playlist that's actually a little more useful for this specific genre is if you type in samples for lo-fi, you're going to find lo-fi sample playlists curated specifically for the genre. So that's useful for finding the records, but the drums themselves, it's a little different, but it's the same. If you type in Reddit drum kits, you're going to find this page is the very first one that pops up. And this has a ton of really high quality drum kits. If you're not too sure what to do when you get to this page, there is a if you're new start here that you can actually click and it's going to show you ultimate boom bap and all this stuff. If you're really fucking broke like me, this is a really great option for you. Also a really great option is this free vinyl kits page. If you type in free vinyl drum kits, this is the first thing that's going to pop up. These are going to be drum samples that were taken off of vinyl records. And lastly, if you actually want to invest a little bit of money into this, if you're pretty serious, you could go and find the official Jake One drum kit, Snare Jordan. Jake One is the man. Watching him make beats is crazy. It's $25. That's a lot of chicken sandwiches. So maybe you don't buy it. These are really great drums. I'm going to be using them for the video. Once you have your drums and your instrumental, it's time to start working in your session. What I'm going to go ahead and do is drag my sample into my session just like that, and I need to figure out the BPM. Now to find the BPM, all I'm going to do is type in tap tempo on Google and click the very first thing that pops up. All you have to do is play your instrumental and then tap in this little box accordingly to the song. Now in this case, I'm hitting around 80 BPM. The best tempos to be around are from 76 to 90 in my opinion. When you're listening to them, they're very passive and they're very relaxing. Just keep that in mind. Like if your instrumental that you really want to use is a little fast, all you have to do to retime it is just select your instrumental, double click, go to File, Function, and then Time and Pitch Machine. You're going to want to use Complex or Universal for the algorithm. Type in the tempo it is and type in somewhere from 76 to 90, process and paste, and you should be good. I've actually done this before, so I know I kind of want somewhere around 76 BPM. Once you have this set, you're ready to go ahead and start chopping. To start chopping, all you have to do is go to the flex editor at the top right here, and then go ahead and click the flex editor individually on this track. It's going to go ahead and analyze your audio real quick. I'm going to go ahead and set my flex timing algorithm to rhythmic. Now, once I'm at this point, I can see each individual transient as a white line on the screen, so I can slice very precisely and make very good chops for the EXS24 that we'll create later. All I do is I just run through and I listen for chords, strums, something that intrigues me. In the beginning, I like to space out my samples that I'm picking, and then later on, if it repeats once or twice, then I'll go through and I'll make chops that are closer together. You don't always want to make really close chops because it's going to be very hard to make a pattern that sounds like it flows from one sample to the next, because if you have a bunch of chops, it's just going to be really fast and it's going to be very distracting. I'm just going to go ahead and make my chops really quick and then we can move on. Now all you have to do to make your chops is go to the very top, right click and hit slice at flex markers, then select the end and delete it so you don't make a sample out of it, and then go to the very beginning and try to get rid of the excess noise that usually starts each song that you're sampling. To put it in the XS24, first I go ahead and disable the flex on both the track and the session itself. Go ahead and select all of the regions, right click, go to convert, and then convert to new sampler track. If you've seen some of my previous videos, you should be familiar with this part. And then you can just name this whatever is meaningful to you. And then I always use C1 to C7 regions, and I don't worry about the one-shot zones. And then just hit OK. You can hide the raw audio and then delete the MIDI because we don't need to use that. Now once you're done with this, go ahead and go onto the track that was just created. Go to the XS24 and then set the envelope. What you're going to want to do is change the release time from short to the longest, and then change the attack from short to a little bit higher, just a very small amount. That's going to eliminate any pops or clicks that could happen at the beginning of your sample. And then change from poly to mono. That's going to make sure that none of your samples overlap. That's important for an MPC style sample. Now that you're done with importing your sample, we'll just go on into the drums. I've already imported my kicks and snares for the sake of time, but I'm just going to show you how you could do this with your hi-hat. All you have to do is create a new track, software instrument, and then go down to an instance of the XS24 and hit create. You should have something like this. Open that window and then hit edit. And if you do not have the edit button, of course, there is that obligatory statement where you have to go to preferences, advanced tools, and then all these bad boys must be checked. Now, once you have this blank page, you're just going to want to go ahead and find your drum samples that you're importing. All I do is hit Command A, it selects all the samples, and then I drag them into the XS24. All these settings are fine, and hit OK. Just save this as something meaningful to you. I've already saved this as the same thing, so I'm going to replace it. The next step, once you've done this, is we can go ahead and start creating our drums. I always start with the hi-hat because it kind of keeps me in time with my snares, my kicks. With the pencil tool, you can write MIDI information without even using a MIDI controller, so this will work for anybody, regardless of how much equipment you have. What I do is I make one note that has a higher velocity than the second note, and then the second note is off time and the first one is on time. Then I select both of those notes, hit Option, and drag them over. I select all four of those notes, and then I Option drag them over. Now I have a very quickly made hi-hat pattern. I drag this out all the way to the beginning of the 9 bars. And this is important because I like to work in 8-bar loops, so it doesn't get as repetitive. Now once you're done with the hi-hat, just go to the snare drum and do the same thing. Snares are commonly on the 2 and the 4. I'm just going to go ahead and write the snare notes, and then I'm going to find the sample that I want to use. Alright, so I ended up finding the snare samples I like. I ended up using 2 at the same time just so I can get a thicker snare sound. And honestly, you don't always have to keep your snares on the 2 and the 4. This is just common practice, and this is just to make things a little easier to start out with. You can start experimenting with this later on, and I would actually encourage that because that'll make a more interesting drum pattern. Alright, so now that I've set my hi-hat and my snare pattern, I kind of got them the way I want them. Now I go on to the kick. I use the hi-hat and the snare to kind of keep me in time, but I like to keep the kick a little off time in general, and that's just to give a nice MPC feel. I like to keep it in the pocket of the beat. I like to play it on my MIDI controller rather than typing it in. There's going to be a little latency, and I'm going to have to kind of tweak a few things later on just because of how much CPU I'm using while I'm recording and while I'm using Logic. So I'm just going to go ahead and play the pattern real quick and kind of work out the way I want my kick drum. Now since my MIDI controller was really off time, I'm just going to go ahead and quantize every note. I'm going to set things off beat manually. Now for this note in particular, I kind of make it a little closer to the snare than it should be, and that creates a very quick snap. Let me go ahead and play that for you. The very end of my drum pattern was fucking bad, so I'm going to fix that real quick. I'm going to go ahead and change my drum sample because I'm not too sure how I feel about that kick. If you want to know how to kind of change samples very quickly, all I do is I select all the notes, hold Option, and then use the arrow up and down keys, and it kind of takes me through them. So now that we have our basic drum pattern, our kick, our snare, and our hi-hat, what I like to do is I like to go ahead and make them sound a little more like they're in a lo-fi hip-hop instrumental before I actually move on to the sample itself. I'm going to go from the hi-hat up to the kick drum. What I usually do first is I throw an EQ on the hi-hat and I take out things around 10K. And this is because having so much high end in your hi-hat is going to take away from the illusion that it is actually a lo-fi song. So that's all that I do really for the hi-hat. So next for the snare, one thing that I've kind of noticed is there's always a lot of attack on the snare drum itself. So one thing that I like to do is I like to throw a compressor on the snare with a slow attack, a medium release. I like to emphasize the transient. So this just kind of brings up the transient of the snare a little more. And then what I like to do is I throw an EQ on the snare drum and I take things out so it doesn't have so much high end again. It's important to dial in the high end on each instrument a little differently because you can take out a lot more on the kick drum than you can on the hi-hat. And then the last thing to work on is the kick. And for the kick drum, it doesn't really matter so much. What I usually do is I throw the compressor on again just to keep things consistent. You don't have to use this compressor, by the way. All you have to do is use a compressor with 4:1 ratio, use about 7 decibels of gain reduction, slow attack, medium release. And for the EQ, you can actually take out a lot more high end because kick drums naturally just don't have it. I usually boost around 200, which I never really do in any other genre. That's just to kind of add an imperfectness to the kick drum. And then the last thing you can do, but I like to throw R bass on the kick drum a lot. There's nothing better than a little R bass. It adds lower end harmonics to your kick drum and it sounds fucking great. So.
Oh, hi Johnny, I didn't know it was you. Here you go.
That's me. How much is it?
It'll be $18.
Here you go. Keep the change. Hi, Doug.
I always end up kind of doing that. Now that you have your drums kind of mixed a little bit, I select all the drums, I go to the mixer window, and I set all their outputs to a similar bus. On this bus, I usually throw like a tape emulation plugin or something. This could be recreated with the Lo-Fi plugin in Pro Tools or a saturation plugin in any DAW. I use a 7.5 inches per second. This is going to slow down the rotations and take away from the quality. I throw the record level up, which is going to give me more tape saturation, and then I throw the wow and flutter up just a little bit. It doesn't really do much on the drums, but it does a lot more when you get the actual record we're flipping. The last thing I like to do is I like to put a send on my kick drum and I like to send it to bus 7. I option click the dial and I set its unity and then I mute the track itself. This is going to give me a kick sidechain track that I can later on use on the record that we're flipping. Now that we've done all that, we can move on to the main sample itself. Now for the main sample, I always like to throw on a little compressor. Now this is important just to keep everything a little more groomed while we're actually messing with the volume with sidechaining and we're actually running into a tape saturation plugin, so everything gets the same amount of saturation. I just look for around 6 dB of gain reduction. Now the only parameter that really matters to me as far as this compression goes is getting about 6 decibels of gain reduction. The attack and release are pretty basic, and then I'm only setting the ratio 3:1 to get a pretty normal amount of compression. So that's pretty much all that is. Then I bring the Kramer tape plugin back up. I kind of do the same amount of stuff that I did before. Wow and flutter, chord level up, and speed back to 7.5 inches per second. And then I do a little EQ. Your EQ is completely up to you. I always set things around 100 to 200. I like things to have a little more low end than high end, and then 5K is usually where things start sounding about right for lo-fi hip hop to me. I'm going to leave that around 5K, and that's pretty good to me. That's about what I want. The next step I'm going to go ahead and do is we're going to add the sidechaining compressor. Now to do this, all you have to do is go to the very top right and change the input to bus 7, which is what we ended up sending the kick drum to when we made that send auxiliary track. I always take the attack, set at 3.5 milliseconds, take it off auto, and drop the release time to about 100. If you don't know what these parameters do, just copy my settings. It's perfectly fine. And then I'm only looking for about 5 decibels of gain reduction. The sidechaining is a very important element in lo-fi hip-hop. I hear it used a lot, and that just kind of adds to the groove. It makes the kick pop out a little more, and it kind of messes with the sample just in the way that it ducks it. It makes a really cool sound. And then one thing I also like to do, this is not necessary whatsoever, I always use the one knob pumper just to kind of give a little more movement to my samples in general. Now that you've suffered through all the tedious mixing bullshit, you're going to want to save that. So just go to the very top and above the EQ and go ahead and save the channel strip setting as, and save it to whatever the you want. We all know what I would call it. Just save it whatever is meaningful to you, and then you're good, and you never have to do that again, because that is a lot of stuff to go through, and I know it's very tedious, but it is really important to the overall sound. So now finally we're at the point where we have our drums, everything's sounding good, and now we can finally flip our sample. At this point, it's completely trial and error. It's all up to you. I like to keep repetitions. I like to think of it as a chord progression. There's always that root note. There's always that root sample that things kind of start with, and then you kind of manipulate it over time. It's always important to use 8-bar loops again, just to kind of avoid a lot of repetition. What I like to do is I like to make 3 individual patterns. There's going to be a verse, a chorus, and an intro. The verse and the chorus need to be 8 bars, and the intro can be 4 bars. So I'm going to go ahead and try to figure out a few patterns, and then I'll be right back.
Keyboards and lay down some kind of beat. I think we need to cut our losses. We get our family and we're out of here. Morty, good music comes from people who are relaxed. Just hit a button, Morty. Give me a beat.
Alright, I I didn't want to waste any of your time, so I kind of did most of the patterns off camera for the sake of it would take fucking forever. Now I have an intro, a verse, and a chorus. Notice the verse and the chorus are both 8-bar loops, and then the introduction is a 4-bar loop. Another thing that I ended up doing on the chorus was I made the drums halftime. How I did this was I have my snares on a loop all the time, so all I had to do was go to the initial loop and change the pattern from 2 and 4 just to 1 on the 3rd. That way the snare just falls a little later and it just creates a different groove. It makes things slow down a little bit, and I kind of like that for the chorus. So that's one thing I did on this song. Actually, now that I think of it, one thing that I like to do also is I like to go between them at the end. So I have it halftime and then full time. For the intro, I kept it very, very repetitive, and then for the verse, I made sure everything was on each beat. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, and it just keeps going throughout the entire instrumental. And then for the chorus, all I was really focused on was feel, so you can kind of notice it wasn't so on beat. I just wanted to mess with the samples, just with personal experience. When you do sample and chop chords, it makes this very, very easy, and you shouldn't have any trouble with this. Now there is one more thing that I like to do, and that is I like to go to the stereo out, right click and click create track. That'll give me the stereo out on this page. And then what I like to do is I like to add that iZotope vinyl plugin. I've done this before on a boom bap beat. I like to throw warp depth up. I like to take the year down. I'm going to go all the way to the 1950s. I like to throw it in mono. Now what I'm going to go ahead and do is I will bypass the plugin past this point. And to do that, all you have to do is hit A on your keyboard. It'll take you to this automation page. Go to main, insert one bypass, and then click in the automation. Make a dot by clicking again, and then just drag it up. Eventually it should just say bypass, and what you're going to want to do is going to keep zooming in and make sure bypass is perfectly on that measure, and then you should be good.
But wait! There's more!
And then one more thing I like to do is I like to put a single band EQ of my instrumentals. I make sure it's on high cut, take the frequency all the way to 20K. I go to the very end, make sure I'm automating the frequency. I go to the outro that I kind of created, make sure there's a dot at the very beginning, and then I go to the very end and I pull it down to about 300 Hertz. If you hold Control and Shift, you can create a curve. What this is going to do is give me a very different kind of fade. It's going to fade by taking out the high end. I'll just go ahead and play it for you so you can kind of hear what it sounds like. I like that method a lot because it takes out the high end, which kind of creates a sense of the volume lowering, but at the same time, it's just a little different than a typical fade. So that's what I like to do a lot of times. The last thing I would do is throw a little vinyl static on the instrumental itself. This is just going to kind of give the illusion that there is a record going. Honestly, there is a option for noise on the iZotope vinyl plugin. So if you want to just use that, you're good. You could just use a combination of these to kind of create a sound that sounds like it's a record spinning. In my last tutorial video, vinyl scratches, I have a download link for some vinyl scratches, and there's actually vinyl static in that pack. So if you go to that video and you find that pack, you should find this sample. All I do is I just drag it into my session. Because I'm OCD as f, I make sure it's at the very, very beginning, and then I option drag the left corner until it's perfectly in line, drag the top right, and I set a loop with it. So that's all I have for you today. If you have any other lo-fi hip-hop questions or any existential questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. I just want to take this time to say I really do appreciate all the support. It's just really cool knowing that when I'm sharing stuff with other people, they're actually getting something out of it. And this video has been way too long, so I'm going to go ahead and end it. I appreciate you. I hope all of you are doing very well, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.
Oh, hi, Mark.